sound of the impact was a bone-shattering, percussive crack that tore through the quiet New York night, a noise so violent it became a permanent scar on the soul of Ava Montgomery. There was no atmospheric rain to soften the blow and no rolling fog to hide her face. There was only the cold, fluorescent hum of the streetlights and the brutal reality of her silver sports car crushing the life out of a young black boy who had been crossing the street in the Bronx. Ava didn't hit the brakes, she didn't even scream. She simply squeezed the steering wheel of her Italian-engineered machine until her leather gloves groaned, staring into the rearview mirror at the motionless, tiny figure shrinking in the distance before she floored the engine and vanished into the city's concrete heart. For 7 years, she built a fortress of wealth and power, becoming the most untouchable CEO in the state of New York, convinced that the ghosts of her past were buried under layers of glass and steel. But today, the walls are closing in as a corporate shark named Julian Thorne threatens to swallow her empire whole through a predatory marriage alliance that she cannot escape alone. To block the merger, Ava has devised a desperate plan to hire a fake husband through an anonymous high-end agency, a man she intends to use as a sacrificial pawn, someone so low status that the Thorne family will eventually back away in disgust. Before we see the man who changes her fate forever, I want to check in with you. Where are you watching this intense journey from right now? Drop your city or state in the comments because we want to see where our community is at. And if you believe that every secret eventually demands a price, I want you to comment the word vendetta right now so I know you're ready for the most shocking reveal of the year. The heavy oak doors to her Manhattan penthouse office swing open, and Andre steps inside, his presence so massive and grounded that the room suddenly feels cramped and fragile. He is a tall, imposing black man, wearing a charcoal-colored hoodie with frayed sleeves and heavy boots that have seen years of hard labor, yet he moves with a grace that feels predatory and ancient. Ava tries to maintain her composure, pushing a legal document across the desk and offering him $100 a day to play the role of her devoted spouse, her voice coming out as a strained whisper. Andre doesn't touch the contract. Instead, his dark eyes scan the luxury office until they land on a miniature model of the very car Ava drove 7 years ago, his expression shifting into a terrifyingly knowing smirk. As he reaches for the pen to sign his life away, his sleeve pulls back just far enough to reveal a jagged, silver scar on his forearm, a mark that perfectly mirrors the silhouette of the car's emblem that broke his body. Ava's heart seizes, her lungs feeling like they've been filled with lead as she looks into the eyes of the boy she left for dead, realizing that the poor man she just hired didn't find her by accident. He picked up the pen, the metal clicking against the glass desk like a gunshot, and signed his name with a calm, terrifying precision that signaled the end of her peace. She thought she was buying a slave to her ambitions, but as Andre stood up and loomed over her, she realized she had just handed the keys to her kingdom to the only person who had every right to destroy it. He didn't know the truth yet, she desperately tried to tell herself, but the way he looked at her made her feel like he had already written the ending to her story before the wedding bells even rang. The ink on the contract was barely dry when the private elevator doors in Ava's penthouse suite slid open with a hydraulic hiss that sounded like a snake warning of an attack, revealing Julian Thorne. He was a man whose Italian silk suit cost more than Andre's entire lifetime earnings and whose smile was a razor-thin veneer over a bottomless pit of arrogant cruelty. He stopped dead, his eyes scanning Andre from his worn-out work boots to his grease-stained collar, and let out a barking, incredulous laugh that echoed off the marble walls like a gunshot in a cathedral. "This is the joke you're playing on me, Ava?" Julian sneered, circling Andre like a shark smelling blood in the water, his voice dripping with the kind of venom that only old money can buy. "You picked a street rat over a thorn? Look at him, he smells like cheap oil and desperation." Andre didn't flinch, he stood rooted to the spot like an ancient oak tree, his expression a terrifyingly blank canvas that gave Julian absolutely nothing to work with. Ava stepped between them, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird, forcing her CEO mask back into place as she declared with a trembling defiance that Andre was her legal husband and that Julian's predatory merger plans were officially dead buried in the East River. The air in the room grew so thick with tension it felt like it might ignite, every second stretching into an eternity as Julian's face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. He stepped closer to Andre, invading his personal space, promising that he would hire every private investigator in the state of New York to dig up the dirt on this nobody and destroy them both before the week was out. But Andre just looked down at Julian with a calm, almost pitying stare, a look that said he had faced demons far worse than a rich boy in a fancy suit. "Be careful which stones you turn over, Mr. Thorne," Andre said, his voice a low, vibrating rumble that seemed to come from the earth itself. "You might find something underneath that bites back." Ava felt a cold sweat break across her forehead at the hidden threat in Andre's words. How could a simple laborer possess such menacing gravity? She grabbed Andre's arm, her grip desperate and tight, pulling him toward the exit as she announced they were leaving the city immediately to stay at his family home in California until the media storm blew over. Julian shouted threats after them as the elevator doors closed, but the real danger was standing right next to her in the confined space of the descending car. As they walked toward her private garage, Andre reached out and ran a calloused hand along the gleaming fender of her new sports car, his touch lingering with a haunting, possessive familiarity that made Ava want to scream. He didn't know the truth yet, or so she desperately tried to convince herself, but as she started the engine, she realized she was no longer the driver in this scenario, she was just another passenger on a ride straight to hell. The road toward the rural outskirts of the California desert was a grueling stretch of heat-shimmered asphalt that seemed to lead nowhere but the end of the world, far away from the polished glass towers of New York where Ava Montgomery felt like a queen. As the dust from the parched earth kicked up against the windows of her luxury SUV, she expected to arrive at a hovel, a place of crumbling wood and genuine misery that would justify the $100-a-day husband she had hired to fool the world. But as they pulled up to the massive, rusted iron gates of a sprawling scrap yard tucked between the jagged hills, the air inside the vehicle shifted, becoming heavy with a mystery she couldn't yet define. Andre stepped out into the blinding California sun, his silhouette framed by stacks of crushed cars and mountains of twisted metal, but as Ava followed him, her nose caught a scent that made her brain short-circuit, the unmistakable, floral aroma of Wui de Hong Pao tea, a rare vintage that cost more per gram than the diamonds she wore on her fingers. They walked past a rusted trailer where a grandmother sat on a porch that looked like it would collapse at any moment, but the woman wasn't holding a common cane. She was leaning on a solid gold imperial scepter encrusted with weathered rubies, using it to point toward a bowl of water for the mangy stray dogs. Ava stopped in her tracks, her eyes bulging as she realized the water bowl was actually a piece of Rue-kiln Celadon pottery from the Song dynasty, an artifact that would cause a literal riot at a Christie's auction. "Welcome home, Andre," the grandmother rasped, her voice like grinding stones, her sharp eyes scanning Ava with an amusement that made the CEO feel like a common trespasser. Ava wanted to scream, to demand an explanation for why a poor boy had a $500 million bowl sitting in the dirt, but she was interrupted by the sound of Andre's father using what looked like a museum-grade Ming Dynasty fire poker to stir a pile of burning trash. The contrast was a sensory nightmare, a rising staircase of confusion that reached its peak when Ava wandered into a back shed and found a pristine, custom-armored Bentley hidden under a filthy tarp, its leather interior smelling of brand-new wealth and old secrets. Sitting on a nearby workbench, next to a pile of rusted bolts, was a stack of black Centurion cards held together by a simple rubber band, discarded as if they were nothing more than junk mail. Ava turned to Andre, her voice cracking with a terrifying mixture of anger and panic, asking him what kind of sick game he was playing and how a family of laborers owned treasures that could buy the entire state of New York. Andre didn't move, the shadows of the scrap yard lengthening as the sun dipped below the hills, making him look less like a pawn and more like a predator who had finally cornered his prey in his own territory. He didn't know the truth yet, she tried to convince herself, but then Andre's father walked out holding a weathered, black-and-white hospital photograph of a young boy with shattered legs and a look of pure agony in his eyes. He handed the photo to Ava, his gaze hard and unforgiving, and asked her if she remembered the street corner in the Bronx where this boy's life was nearly snuffed out by a silver car that never bothered to stop. The micro-cliffhanger hit like a physical blow, the silence of the California desert echoing the screams from 7 years ago that Ava had tried so hard to forget. As she realized she hadn't escaped the past at all, she had driven herself straight into the heart of its revenge. The silence of the California desert was shattered by the rhythmic thunder of a dozen black SUVs descending upon the scrap yard like a swarm of angry hornets, their tires kicking up a massive cloud of ochre dust that coated the luxury paint of Ava Montgomery's vehicle in a layer of grime. Julian Thorne stepped out of the lead car, his eyes gleaming with a predatory, manic triumph as he gestured toward a team of federal agents who were already unholstering their weapons and swarming the mountain of rusted metal. "I told you I'd find the dirt on your little pet, Ava." Julian screamed over the roar of the idling engines, his voice a jagged edge of pure arrogance that cut through the hot desert air. "I've tracked the movement of these artifacts across 3 state lines, and now I have the proof that you and your husband are running the largest illegal smuggling ring in the history of the United States." He pointed a trembling, greedy finger at the roux kiln bowl sitting on the dirt table, demanding that the lead agent seize it immediately as evidence of a multi-billion-dollar crime against cultural heritage. Julian had brought a full live-streaming crew with him, determined to broadcast Ava's public execution and the total collapse of her reputation to millions of viewers who were already flooding the chat with the word guilty. He called forward an expert appraiser, a cold-eyed woman named Dr. Evelyn Chase, who was widely considered the final authority on ancient ceramics and royal artifacts in the country. Dr. Chase approached the chicken bowl with a look of extreme skepticism, her white gloves stark against the grid of the junkyard, but as she leaned in to inspect the delicate glaze, her entire body began to tremble with a visible, kinetic shock. "This isn't a crime scene," Dr. Chase whispered into her lapel microphone, her voice carrying through the live stream and hitting Julian like a physical blow to the stomach. "This is the private, ancestral collection of the Vanguard estate, the most powerful, hidden financial force in North America, and every piece here is legally documented and insured for 10 times the value of the Thorne family's entire company." The face-slapping was so sudden and violent that Julian actually stumbled backward into the dirt, his face turning a sickly shade of gray as the federal agents immediately lowered their weapons and stood at professional attention. Andre stepped forward, his hoodie pulled back to reveal a face that suddenly looked regal and untouchable, his presence expanding to dominate the entire desert landscape. "You wanted to find out where my family got their money, Julian?" Andre's voice was a low, terrifying rumble that seemed to silence the desert winds themselves. "We didn't steal these treasures, we bought the museums they were supposed to go to, along with the banks that hold your family's debt." Netizens in the chat were losing their minds, the comment section moving too fast to read as they realized the poor boy was actually the crown prince of a trillion-dollar legacy that had been living in self-imposed exile. Julian's assets were being frozen in real time as Jasmine, Andre's sister and a global tech tycoon, stepped out of a nearby armored helicopter that had landed without a sound on the edge of the property. But as the crowd on the screen cheered for the underdog turned king, Andre turned his gaze toward Ava, his eyes narrowing as he reached into a pocket of his frayed hoodie and pulled out a jagged, sharp piece of silver chrome. It was a bumper fragment from the car that hit him 7 years ago, a piece of evidence he had kept as a reminder of the night his world was shattered, and he laid it on the table next to the $500 million bowl. "The certificates for the pottery are all here, Julian," Andre said, his voice dropping to a deadly, cinematic whisper that only Ava could hear. "But now it's time to talk about the hit and run that started this whole story." Ava felt the ground vanish beneath her feet, the micro cliffhanger hitting her like a freight train as she realized the king had finally decided to judge his queen. The high-key desert sun filtered through the dust-moted windows of the farmhouse as Julian Thorne was hauled away in shackles, his screams of filtered rage fading into the distance and leaving behind a silence so thick it felt like it was crushing the air right out of Ava Montgomery's lungs. She stood paralyzed, her designer clothes feeling like a lead weight against her skin, as Andre turned toward her with a slow, deliberate grace that signaled the end of his performance as the submissive, $100-a-day husband. He didn't speak immediately. Instead, he began to unbutton the frayed charcoal hoodie, his movements rhythmic and cinematic, each slide of the metal zipper sounding like a gavel striking a death sentence in the quiet room. Ava wanted to run, to flee back to the safety of her New York penthouse, but her feet were rooted to the floor as Andre pulled the fabric away to reveal a torso of corded muscle and a silver, jagged scar that slashed across his chest in the exact, unmistakable shape of the chrome eagle from her car. I waited 2,555 days to see your face when you finally realized who I was, Andre whispered, his voice a low, terrifying vibration that seemed to make the very walls of the farmhouse tremble with the weight of 7 years of stored-up justice. He didn't look at her with the hatred she expected. He looked at her with a devastating, cold clarity that was far worse, explaining that the online agency she had used wasn't an anonymous service but a trap he had spent 3 years and $10 billion meticulously setting to catch her in his web. Ava collapsed onto a weathered wooden chair, her hands shaking so violently she had to clench them into fists, the guilt she had tried to bury under skyscrapers and stock options finally erupting like a volcano that threatened to incinerate her entire existence. She tried to stammer out a plea for mercy, a justification for that night in the Bronx, but Andre simply walked closer until his massive shadow completely eclipsed her, his presence a rising staircase of emotional pressure that made it impossible for her to draw a full breath. You thought you were buying a pawn, Ava, but you were actually signing the deed to your own judgment, he said, his eyes reflecting the harsh California light like twin obsidian mirrors that held no room for excuses or corporate lies. He reached out and touched the miniature car model on the table, the same model that had been his only clue for 7 years, and for a split second, the air in the room felt like it was about to ignite with the friction of their shared, dark history. The first micro-cliffhanger dropped when Andre's phone buzzed on the table, a high-priority encrypted alert from his sister Jasmine in New York showing that Julian's father had just ordered a total blackout of the Montgomery Tower and was sending a demolition crew to erase the evidence of their failure while Ava's loyal staff was still trapped inside. Andre didn't flinch at the news of the impending massacre. He simply looked at the woman who had once tried to kill him and asked her if she was ready to die for the empire she had built on his blood, or if she was finally ready to stand by his side and fight for the truth as his real wife. He didn't know the truth yet, she thought, about the secret recorded confession she had already hidden in her desk to atone for her sins, but as the first warning sirens began to wail in the distance, Ava realized that the night of reckoning had only just begun and that her survival now depended entirely on the man whose life she had tried to snuff out 7 years ago. The flight back to the gleaming skyline of Manhattan was a high-velocity, cinematic race against a clock that was ticking toward the total annihilation of Ava Montgomery's legacy, but as the armored Vanguard helicopter banked over the Hudson River, the fear in Ava's chest was replaced by a cold, burning determination she had never felt before. They landed on the roof of the Montgomery Tower just as the demolition crews, hired by the desperate Thorne family, were preparing to ignite the structural charges, but the men froze in their tracks as a small army of private security, led by the tech tycoon Jasmine, descended from the skies like vengeful angels. Andre stepped out of the aircraft, his cheap hoodie discarded to reveal a custom-tailored suit that fit his massive frame like a suit of modern armor, his presence so commanding that the entire construction crew dropped their equipment and fled in terror. Down in the lobby, Julian Thorne's father was already celebrating his victory, champagne in hand, until the heavy glass doors were kicked open and Andre walked in with Ava by his side, his shadow stretching across the marble floor like a harbinger of the apocalypse. The face-slapping was so complete and absolute that the elder Thorne actually dropped his glass, the crystal shattering against the floor as Jasmine handed him a legal injunction that proved the Vanguard estate had just completed a hostile takeover of the Thorne family's entire portfolio in less than 20 minutes. You thought you could erase the evidence of your crimes by burning down this building? Andre's voice was a low, melodic thunder that silenced every person in the room, his eyes fixed on the man who had tried to help his son bury the truth. But you forgot that I don't just own the ground this tower stands on, I own the air you're currently breathing. Netizens on the live stream were erupting with a frenzy of comments as the news broke that the poor boy from the California scrap yard was now the undisputed king of New York's financial district, a rising staircase of justice that was finally reaching its peak. Before we reveal the final, heart-wrenching moment between Ava and Andre, I want to take a second to thank you for coming on this incredible journey with us. If you loved seeing the Thorne family finally get what they deserved, please hit that like button right now. Make sure you comment the word "redeemed" in the section below so we know you stayed until the end, and don't forget to share this video with everyone who loves a powerful story of survival and revenge. Most importantly, if you haven't already, subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell because we have dozens of even more intense, high-stakes dramas coming your way very soon. As the police arrived to haul the Thorne family away in shackles, Andre turned to Ava on the balcony of the penthouse, the city lights reflecting in his obsidian eyes as he pulled a velvet box from his pocket. Inside was a ring crafted from the silver chrome of the car that had once broken him, transformed into a symbol of a love that had survived the ultimate betrayal. Ava didn't just accept the ring, she handed him the recorded confession she had kept for 7 years, a final act of accountability that proved she was finally worthy of standing by his side as a queen. The wedding that followed was the grandest in the history of the state, a celebration of a boy who was once left for dead but returned as a trillion-dollar husband to save the woman who had once tried to destroy him. They didn't just build an empire together, they built a legacy of truth, proving that while the past might be written in blood, the future is always written in the choices we make today. Thank you for watching the finale of this viral saga, and stay tuned, because the next king is already waiting in the shadows to reclaim his crown.